Good evening. The microphone works? Good, I'm glad. So I made a big faux pas this evening. So I was reading this book over the last couple of weeks, and I'd underlined all these sections, and I thought, I can't wait. I'm gonna go in. I'm gonna go to the 92nd Street Y, and I'm gonna read all these great lines out to people, and I'm gonna say, really, essentially, you can open this novel anywhere and find some sort of marvelous parcel of language. So I got here this evening, and then I remembered that I'd left my book at home, all marked up. So to test myself over the last 10 minutes, I said, can you do that? So we should all do it together. On the morrow, the city wore a summer haze like a fine muslin hanging, though which high up at the level of tall windows and rooftops of polished slate, there showed numerous jewel-like slivery gleams and hot little glints of gold. How to start a chapter. The day had indeed cooled somewhat. The sunlit mist in the valley had softened from glitter to glow, and even the crickets seemed less desperate in the flinging out of their nets of scraped and numbling, vibrant song. Ooh. For many weeks, since the day indeed when her husband's perfidious secrets had been revealed to Isabel at last, a question had lain deep in the thickets of her consciousness like a sprung steel snare. A question among the many questions she did not wish to know the answers to and would have preferred not even to address. Right? You can feel it. The day was delightfully fresh and clear under a sky of unblemished blue that bespoke the coolly lucid north more than it did the varnished south. Shall we go on? We must go on. I am delighted to introduce John Banville tonight. Examine those sentences, hear those sentences, and see how it is that they operate on so many different levels with sound and theater and rhythm and humor and intent. Mrs. Osmond is a sequel to Henry James's most famous novel, The Portrait of a Lady. It is also entirely a John Banville novel. Isabel Archer is, as most of you know, the character at the heart of Portrait. In James's novel, Isabel is brought in the late 19th century from Albany to Europe, or as John puts it, the fabled continent. Here, she falls into a large inheritance and is lured into a marriage with Gilbert Osmond. Given a chance to free herself from that marriage, she chooses to return to her husband in Italy. Everywhere we are is everywhere where we have been. And this is where John Banville's daring, and dare I say it, dash, with of course a splash of ponder, begins to take us to everywhere we have yet to be. This, to me, is the miracle of literature, to continue the story and to make the imagined real. Mrs. Ormond is a novel of great psychological power, a stylistic masterpiece about vengeance and living out your life long after others, even the creators of your life, think it's over. John Berger once said, "If I'd have known as a child what the life of an adult would have been, I never would have believed it. I never could have believed it would be so unfinished." This is a book about how our lives are constantly unfinished. It doesn't refute the past or refuse the past. In fact, the past is woven in with such great subtlety into the narrative that you will be astounded by how characters that you knew before will appear again. And it reintroduces us to those we've met and then draws us further into other new lives. It very much touches, for me, on James Joyce's notion that we should recreate life out of life. And if literature is life, then John Banville has recreated life out of life. And this is what he does. He recreates and he unfolds a life for us so that one story will never be the only one. We are living nowadays in what should be known as the exponential age, a sequence of rapidly punctuated evolutions, a sort of carousel of quickening where everything is faster, smaller, faster and cheaper, faster and incomprehensibly reduced. The world is in a flux, tightening and tightening. We are in the widening gyre, but Banville refuses somehow to cow to that notion of making it only belong to the reduced. He has described Henry James as his principal influence, and so he operates like a musician taking over the music of another renowned musician, extending the song, if you will, bringing it elsewhere. Some people have talked about it in the reviews as an act of ventriloquism, but I think that refuses the absolute artistry that is on display here. Banville manages to capture the theater of the moment, and we all know what the theater meant to Mr. Henry James, and he risks failure. Another of the great influences on John Banville was Samuel Beckett, of whom John said this, quote, "Since Waiting for Godot in the 1950s brought him to the attention of a wide, if largely bemused audience, he, Beckett, has been regarded as the great pessimist whose Manichaean vision of humankind's benighted condition in the world demanded extreme and fractured styles of linguistic expression. To conceive of Beckett's work in this way, however, is to view it through the wrong end of the telescope. From the start, his concern was with language itself, its possibilities as a key to the house of being, its areas of recalcitrance and exhaustion, its capacity to aestheticize and therefore, in some sense, redeem quotidian reality, or, viewed from a bleaker standpoint, inauthenticate and betray it. Thus, at an essential level, Beckett's increasingly refined raids on the inarticulate are no more than technical exercises. No more and no less. What is remarkable, what is well-nigh miraculous, is that from these seemingly sterile forays, he should bring back a representation of humanity and the world so persuasive and so thrilling with poetic intensity. A representation of humanity and a world so persuasive and of such thrilling poetic intensity. It's almost as if we can blend here these ideas of the influence of Henry James and Samuel Beckett. Beckett and James? Do I hear the snickers? The odd couple indeed. But if we blend the great flourishing theater of the Jamesian novel with the Beckettian impulse to raid the inarticulate or to extend the untold story, which is absolutely what Beckett was about, we have so much about what this novel, Mrs. Ormond, happens to be. I'm kind of waiting for the sequence to Malloy, but I will say this. John Banville has written 17 books, among them, as you know, Ancient Light, The Book of Evidence, Dr. Copernicus, The Untouchable, The Sea. He's won the Man Booker Prize, the Lannan Literary Award, several other major awards all across the world. But literature is not an Olympics. And if it were, as far as I'm concerned, both he and Claire Messud would get the gold medal in my book. It's a joint prize. But that's not what matters. What matters is, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can see, the great daring that takes place in his work. In this book, in particular, he risks sentiment. And yet he knows that sentiment without the proper language is the ruin of idea. Sentiment without power and without purpose becomes sentimentality, and it would never work. John Banville, in this book, takes this dare and he makes of it an asset. He reinvigorates the past and shapes then a classic into a classic. So, one last word from another great writer, Vladimir Nabokov. Herein lies the sense of literary creation, to portray ordinary objects as they will be reflected in the kindly mirrors of future times, to find in the objects around us the fragrant tenderness that only posterity will discern and appreciate in far-off times when every trifle of our plain everyday life will become exquisite and festive in its own right. The times when a man who might have put on the most ordinary jacket of today will be dressed up for an elegant masquerade. John Banville brings us back. Thank you.
I'm afraid after that I can only be an anticlimax or a mere footnote. Thank you, Colum. Extraordinarily generous introduction. I will try my best to live up to it and probably fail. I'll just read a few bits from the opening chapters of the book to give you the sound of it and something of the rhythm of it. It begins, my book begins where the Portrait of a Lady ends. Isabel has defied her husband and come to England, to Garden Court, to be at the deathbed of her cousin, Ralph Touchett. And now she's coming back to London, and James famously said of her that she was a person who had to affront her fate. And in my book, she tries to figure out how to do it. I thought I would allow her to do it, but someone else would have to do a sequel to my sequel. Anyway, these are the opening pages. It had been a day of agitations and alarms, of smoke and steam and grit. Even yet she felt, did Mrs. Osmond, the awful surge and rhythm of the train's wheels beating on and on within her. It was as if she were still seated at the carriage window, as she had sat for what seemed impossibly many hours, gazing with unseeing eyes upon the placid English countryside flowing away from her endlessly in all the soft green splendor of this early summer afternoon. Her thoughts had sped along with the speeding train, but, unlike the train, to no end. Indeed, she had never registered so acutely the mind's unstoppable, senseless, headlong rush as she had since leaving Garden Court. The great snorting and smoking brute that had paused with brusque impatience at the meek little village station and suffered her to take her place in one of its lattermost compartments Her fingertips still retained the impression of hot plush and greasy leather. It now stood gasping after its mighty efforts under the high, soot-blackened glass canopy of the throbbing terminus, disgorging onto the platform its complement of dazed, bedraggled travellers and their jumbles of baggage. Well, she told herself, at least she had arrived somewhere. She longed for the hotel and its stilly breathing, cool and shadowed spaces in which she might sit perfectly immobile for a long time and let her reeling mind run down of its own accord. She would rest, if only she could stop thinking. But how to effect that marvelous trick? The death of her cousin, Ralph Touchett, on a recent eve in his mother's house at Garden Court, had left her with a hard task to solve, like an exercise in geometry or algebra. The solution she was required to derive was no more or less than to find a fit mode by which to mourn the young man's passing. In truth, her cousin could no longer have been described as young, but that was how she thought of him, and no doubt how she would think of him always. Perhaps that was the main part of her difficulty, that it seemed a scandal to shed tears for a person whose life had been so marked by the slow vastation of a wasting illness that he could hardly have been said to have had a life at all. Thinking this, she at once chided herself. Who was she to judge the quality of any life, however brief or burdened? Behind the chidden thought, however, lay a darker, irrepressible formulation, which was that the intensest living Ralph had done, he had done through her, watching in smiling wonderment from his seat at the ringside, her breathtaking flights, her spangled swoopings to and fro in the powdery light high up, oh, so high up, under the tremendous top. To have lived through someone else, or even someone he professed to adore, that had been the height of Ralph's triumph and the depth of his failure. How she wished now she'd been capable of that greatness he had hoped for in her, those loftier leaps, those ever more graceful pirouettes in midair, those weightless landings on one braced toe, those sweeping bows with swan's neck arms widespread. If she had lifted him up, she'd also let him down. What he could not have expected, what he could not have imagined possible for one so firmly balanced as she, was the catastrophic plunge from airy heights that had been precipitated by her marrying the perfectly wrong person. Coming out at last from the cinder-smelling confines of the railway station, she felt as if she had dived into some clear, light, vaporous medium that was at once more and less than air. She had lived for so long amid southern harshnesses that London looked to her almost immaterial, with no sharp edges to it at all. Even in sunlight, as now, the city had a pearly sheen, and its shadows were the deepest shade of lilac. The crowds, too, weaving their endlessly shifting tapestry to and fro before her, had to her eye a quality of dreamy vagueness, as if all these people, despite the determination of their step and the fixity of their forward gaze, were not entirely certain of their destination, as likewise they could not quite remember their setting off place, and yet minded not at all in either case. Already she felt soothed. She had not been aware before arriving in it how achingly she had yearned for the strangely tender accommodations of this great metropolis of the north. Before she discerned the man himself, her ear was caught by the sound of his weeping. It was a strange, unhuman sound, and at first she looked about for some wounded creature nearby, a fledgling perhaps fallen from the edge of some high parapet and mewling for its mother. But no, it was a man. He was burly and broad, but not at all strong-looking, with a big box-shaped head and hair of fiery ginger shade and curly ginger whiskers. He had positioned himself at the corner of the wide thoroughfare that led the way out of the station precincts. She did not think she'd ever seen or heard a grown man crying like this, copiously, helplessly, unstaunchably. His washed blue eyes were red-rimmed, and his swollen and glistening nether lip trembled like a baby's. He wore a collarless shirt, an ancient pair of moleskin trousers, shiny with grime, and a jacket of rusty serge that was much too small for him and pinched him under the armpits and left his frail white wrists defenselessly exposed. He stood in one spot, but kept turning his body first in one direction and then the other, caught, it seemed, in a trance of convulsive indecision. It had seemed at first he was wearing shoes, but now that Isabel looked more closely, she saw that his feet were bare, but thoroughly caked with black, tar-like dirt. The coppery brightness of his whiskers, through which dark, glinting rivulets of tears were coursing, and the pulpy paleness of his lightly freckled skin somehow added to and intensified for her the sorrow and abjection of the spectacle he made. It was as if he had been flayed of a protective integument, and his flaming hair were blushing for him to be so nakedly and shamelessly on show. "Oh, look at that poor creature," she breathed, laying a hand on her maid's arm to stay her. "We must do something to help him." How had the man arrived at such a sorry pass? From the intense manner of his weeping, it might have newly dawned on him how desperate were his circumstances. Yet it was not lately he had stumbled into such wretched straits. That much was plain. Perhaps some fresh misfortune had just befallen him. It seemed to Isabel that he was bewailing not the particular but the general, as if today at last all of his misfortunate and bedeviled life, if it merited to be called a life, had come to a head somehow and overwhelmed him. She suspected there would be no comforting a sorrow such as his, yet that suspicion, however strong it might be, did not exonerate her. Was it not her duty, from her place of vantage, to reach down a hand to the crushed and helpless, to the ones who might have soared but instead had plummeted from the sky, and lay now with broken wing, flailing and twitching on the pavement at her feet? Her spirit, the better part of her, moaned in sympathy with the weeping man. Yet in another cold and calculating region of her consciousness, the necessary defenses were already being erected. What, after all, could she have done for the poor wretch? What comfort would a word of hers have brought to him? Money, yes, she might have given him money, and a large portion of it at that. But even her silver would not have saved him, for surely he was beyond saving. No, as well hope to help the lost souls in Hades. And yet, she arrives at the hotel, and there she has a brief encounter with a figure whom you may recognize. She goes for a solitary dinner in the hotel dining room. It was early, and she thought at first the small dim room was empty. How expectant the chairs and tables seemed, bedecked with silver and crystal and linen, and carefully arranged in ranks, like so many dancers ready to plunge into a waltz and tensely awaiting the first crashing chord from the orchestra. The maitre d' appeared, and she was murmuringly led to a place in the corner and deftly seated there, although, despite the man's soft obsequiousness of manner, she had momentarily the sense of having been screwed down into her chair like a cork forced into the neck of a bottle. Restaurants always reminded her a little of the schoolroom, if an unusually democratic and well-appointed one, where she'd been sent to receive lessons in some of the finer and more venerable social disciplines. She was handed the menu, and glancing about, as one does when this small ceremony is being enacted, she spied at a table in the corner diagonally across from hers a gentleman of somewhat stout appearance, bearded and balding, who was reading a newspaper with the aid of a pair of pince-nez. He was, she judged, on the brink of his middle years, though still displaying an aspect of youthful vigor, despite the marked rotundity that strained the buttons of the lower half of his waistcoat. This waistcoat was the sole slightly remarkable aspect of himself that he presented to the world's inspection. For while his jacket and his flowing bow tie were mutely black, and his starched collar was a pillar of pristine whiteness, his gaily sported vest was composed of alternating vertical stripes of sky blue and buttercup yellow satin. Such a splash of colours set her to wondering what he might be, a man of the theatre perhaps, an actor-manager, or even a playwright. She could see from the skill with which he had folded his newspaper for ease of propping against the water jug that he was well accustomed to dining alone. Feeling her eye on him now, he lifted his head and regarded her with cool directness over the steel rims of the spectacles clipped to the bridge of his nose. She essayed a small smile, which he did not return, not out of coldness or unfriendliness, it seemed, but as if he considered a reciprocal gesture of politeness on his part would be superfluous. He went on looking at her for some moments, quite still and calm and not at all intrusively, but taking her in merely, as she immediately was. Did he know her? Had they met at some time, somewhere? He seemed in a way familiar. She had the impression, caught there in the unblinking beam of those preternaturally wide-open, glossy grey and somewhat protuberant eyes, that she was being checked and assessed. No, reassessed. She might have been a portrait that he, the portraitist, had come upon unexpectedly, hanging on the wall of a gallery he had chanced to wander into, and in front of which he had paused, looking to see how his composition had weathered with the years and what time had done to the quality of the pigment. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. And now, away from James, away from our wonderful John Banville, on to American, French, Algerian, other modern and timeless concerns. I'm here to talk about Claire Messud, who's written 6 books, 5 novels, and I wanted to tell you the story about the one she's going to be reading from tonight. It's called The Burning Girl. And this summer, I was reading it on the deck of a share house in Fire Island, reading Burning Girl in Fire Island, on a deck that had in fact caught fire and nearly burned down 2 weeks before, the fire had been stopped in the nick of time, but you could see the new construction. So sitting on this restored precarious ledge of this nearly burned structure, I was reading this book. And the book caught me by surprise because I've been reading Claire's novels for 20 years, and they always have an intellectual intricacy, a close inspection, a thoughtfulness that draws you in and makes you think and worry. But this one was disarming because its subjects were young American girls, teenage girls in a Boston suburb, and the story was narrated by one of them, a clever girl named Julia, called Juju by most people. And she was reciting the narrative, recalling the story of a best friendship, her childhood best friendship, with a less introspective, kind of careless, lively girl named Cassie Burns. And initially, you could think, oh, well, this is simply the story of a collapsed childhood friendship. But you know, there's nothing simple about that. And what Claire, with her usual meticulous observation and sensitive, expansive empathy, realized is the violence of the loss of a best friendship. It's a tragedy that happens to nearly all of us in our lives. But in this book, she showed the particular pain that Julia felt, as at only about 17, she remembered this horrific friendship loss that had happened 4 years before. And as I continued reading and you saw her remembering, like a jilted lover, like a stalker almost, the tiny variations in their friendship that dismayed and disrupted her life, I had thought that the burning girl was probably Cassie Burns. She seemed a little, not hoydenish, but more at risk. There was some strange, creepy older man on the contours of her life who maybe was getting in there. And it was only as the story progressed and Julia's ardent fury became more and more apparent, and Julia began to talk about the things that angered her as a protected daughter of well-meaning liberal parents, the anger she felt at realizing how vulnerable she was as a girl, how she resented coming into womanhood and needing to be afraid. And the story just infinitely increased in complexity and expanded, but always with these very real, vivid, relatable, emotional, and American cues to their teenage life and her emotions. And I realized, well, maybe they're both burning girls, but I think Julia is the burning girl of the title. And it made me think of another novel that has come to the fore recently about the power and trickiness of female friendships, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, where you begin to realize that there's a question as to who is the brilliant friend. So I was reviewing that book on that deck that day, and it took me back to a few years before when I'd been reviewing another book by Claire, which was called The Woman Upstairs. And the new book I was reviewing for Oprah, the previous book I was reviewing for the Times. And it struck me that, though very different, the books were both grappling with a similar issue, which was female anger and female identity. The Woman Upstairs was about a woman about 40 who was frustrated at all she had not become. She was a frustrated artist, and as she puzzled out her anger in that richly developed story, I thought of another author, which was Jane Eyre. And this is the curse of the literary critic. There's nothing you read that doesn't make you think of something else. So it's a testament to Claire Messud that in reading her, you think of her writing in her book. But there were echoes, resonances. And in Jane Eyre, there's a mad woman in the attic who's Bertha Mason, the secret wife of Mr. Rochester. And all of her unfemininity, her anger, her excessive emotion, even her outward display of intelligence, her vehemence, were uncomfortable, not necessarily for her, but for people who hid her or who had to deal with her. And that made me think just of the special, distinct, hard task that Claire Messud has set herself, and as a writer and as an originator. And I wanted to recall for you an incident which I will only give a loose sketch of it. I was telling Claire about it in the last day or two, and she doesn't remember it. But she and I both were at college at the same time. I didn't know her, but I met her once. It was maybe the first or second week of my freshman year. And I was walking out of a French literary seminar. It was called Literature and Evil, La littérature et le mal. But I will say this. I had thought it was the height of the preppy craze, and coming to Yale from Oklahoma, I was afraid of what the girls at school would be like. I thought they would be protected and pampered, privileged. And so I bought myself a kind of fake costume wardrobe. So I was walking around, leaving this high-powered French lit class on Evil, wearing a teddy bear knit sweater from a very preppy locale and saddle shoes, when someone walked me across campus, and there was Claire standing with a man who looked like Sartre. And I was struck so instantly by her character, by her lack of dissembling, by the fact that she wasn't wearing a Fair Isle sweater, that my idea of how a woman had to present herself was broader and wider and more self-defined than I had thought it might be. And I went back to my room and put all of the silly clothes in a trunk and wore black until I graduated. But meeting her, and again, I didn't see Claire until maybe 10, 12 years later in New York. From that first meeting, I just derived an impression, there's a woman of character and purpose. What is she going to do? She's going to do something. And very soon, we found out there was her first novel in 1995, which was called When the World Was Steady, about two sisters raising an elderly parent. Then a few years later, there was a novel called The Last Life. And that one stayed with me. And I remembered it this summer, reading The Burning Girl and thinking back to the woman upstairs. Because there's a line in The Last Life. The narrator is talking about adolescence. And she's saying how it's a period in which you're in a curious station en route from ignorance to, but then the narrator doesn't say to full understanding, but to gauging your misunderstandings, to understand the limits of what you can know. And that for me holds the subtlety of Claire Messud's writing, that she is always focusing on difficult, emotional, intellectual thoughts wrapped up in the identity of women, not only women, but of people pulling themselves into identity from their surroundings, kind of like a Michelangelo figure emerging from the stone. She is bringing out that identity, looking at it in the face. People often talk about the difficulty of talking about the elephant in the room, whatever it may be, some crisis. But the elephant that Claire faces, I would say, is outside of the room. It's female emotion, intensity, anger, and the discomfort those girls and women might feel with themselves, but that others definitely feel when they are contemplating that level of strong character, of dissatisfaction, of purpose. They don't want to look at it outside of the room they're in and think about it. And I think that the task that Claire Messud has done in her novels of facing the identity issues, the hypocrisies of our society, and the tender human emotions that underlie and complicate the rapport of these people carving out their selves shows the character that I caught in my first glimpse of her on campus more than 30 years ago, and which all of us can read in her brilliant novels. I bring you Claire Messud, who will read from The Burning Girl. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Liesl, for that wonderful introduction. I have to say, I'm reminded of the fact that I saw an old writing teacher not long ago, and he said, "So, Claire, are you still cutting your own hair?" Which may be what Liesl's referring to. The answer, I said, no. As a matter of fact, I pay a certain amount to have my hair cut for me now. But it's a real honor to be here, and such an honor to read with John and Liesl. Thank you so much. And yeah, so I'm going to read a couple of little bits from The Burning Girl, and I wanted to say just a couple of things. I mean, Liesl described the book. I wanted in writing this story, which is told by Julia, who's the narrator at the age of 17, looking back, and it's about the unraveling of this friendship with Cassie. And I wanted it to be a little like jazz. I wanted it to be a very simple melody with riffs, if you will. And people say, well, you know, people have said, why write a novel about teenage girls? And there are a lot of answers, and I could go on for sort of 20 minutes, but I won't. I'll just go on. I'll say just a couple of things. One is that almost every woman has lost a best friend at some point, and for many of us, it's something that happens in those adolescent passage. And the stories of teenage girls are nevertheless the most reviled. They're the most dismissed. They're the ones that we think we don't have to pay attention to. It's just teen girl drama. But in fact, that period of our lives is when we are formed as people, and those years shape who we will be as adults. And in connection with which, I would just say, if you are struggling with any adult in your life, you have only to picture them in middle school, and everything will become clear. And that works without fail. I mean, I remember somebody saying to me long ago, like, just picture people naked. I feel like I have no desire to picture people naked. On the other hand, as soon as I picture people in middle school, I understand everything. Donald Trump, Harvey Weinstein, right? Picture these people in middle school. You remember these people. You knew them then. Anyway, you know them now. We don't change. So, but the other thing so when I say there are these riffs, it's this is, for me, as much as it is a story about this friendship between these girls, it's a story about stories and about how we tell ourselves stories, how we make up stories about ourselves and about the people around us, and about how we are made up as much of our literarily lived lives as we are of our literally lived lives. And in fact, when Liesl was referring to these other books, I thought, of course, because that's how we are who we are. My father always used to say, culture is what's left when you've forgotten everything, which, if you're me, is good, because I forget everything. But I do think, we internalize all kinds of different narratives, and they get sort of macerated and forgotten, but they're in there, and they shape our understanding of how the world works, of who we are, and of how people are, of how people behave. And so this is a story about these girls, and it's a story about that process too. So I'll read a little bit from the beginning and then a little bit from later on. It's a different story depending on where you start, who's good, who's bad, what it all means. Each of us shapes our stories so they make sense of who we think we are. I can begin when Cassie and I were best friends, or I can begin when we weren't anymore, or I can begin at the dark end and tell it all backward. There's no beginning before, though. Cassie and I met at nursery school, and I can't remember a time when I didn't know her, when I didn't pick her sleek white head out of a crowd and know exactly where she was in a room and think of her some ways as mine. Cassie was tiny, with bones like a bird. She was always the smallest girl in the class, and the span of her ankle was the span of my wrist. She had shiny, white blonde hair, almost albino, she was so fair, her skin translucent and a little pink. But you'd be wrong to mistake her size and pallor for frailty. All you had to do was to look into her eyes, still blue eyes that turned gray in dark weather like the water in the quarry, and you could see that she was tough. Strong, I guess, is a better word, although, of course, in the end, she wasn't strong enough. But even when we were small, she had a quality about her, a what the hell, and I'm not chicken or you sort of way. According to my mother and to Cassie's mother, Bev, Cassie and I became friends in the second week of nursery when we were 4 years old. That was always the story, though I can't tell now whether I remember it or have just been told so many times that I invented the memory. I was playing with a group of kids in the sandbox, and Cassie stood in the middle of the playground, hands at her sides like a zombie, staring at everything, not apparently nervous, but totally detached. I left my friends to come touch her elbow, and I said so. I was told, hey, come build a castle with me. And she broke into that rare, broad smile of hers, a famous smile made all the better when she was bigger by the Georgia Jagger gap between her front teeth. She came with me back to the sandbox. And that, my mother always said, was that. So the first section of the book takes place in the summer after, between 6th and 7th grade, and the girls are working at an animal shelter, but Cassie unfortunately gets bitten by a dog, and her arm she has to have stitches, and it's all bound up, and they stop working there, and then they have to find something to do. And what they decide to do out of town, they live in a fictional town in the northeast corner of Massachusetts, and they decide to head out to the quarry outside of town and maybe look for the abandoned asylum that's in behind. The quarry was where the older kids partied in the summer and where we went swimming occasionally with our parents and their friends who belonged. It was about a mile west of Royston off a little county road down a dirt track between two private houses. Abandoned over 100 years ago, the old quarry is filled with glorious, rare, gray-green water, a color out of an old oil painting. In some lights, the great boulders gleam gold, but the word that comes to mind is tawny, like a lion. The quarry itself is lion-colored, which is why the Royston Town Hall, built in the 1870s with its stones, is lion-colored also. Strictly speaking, the quarry is a private pool. It belongs to the local land association, a group of trustees who bought up a bunch of acreage between Cape Ann and the New Hampshire border and run it as a kind of nature charity. You're supposed to have a membership. I have to say, my editor was like, "What is that?" And I said, no, that's just what we do in Massachusetts. Anyway, halfway along the dirt road, a chain hangs across it, but there's no lock on the chain, and if you're biking or walking, you can slip around it. There's no lifeguard or caretaker except Rudy, who also takes care of the cemetery. He drives over every so often unannounced in his dark orange pickup with his one-eyed German shepherd, Bessie, to make sure nothing crazy is going on. He's not a bad guy, Rudy, though he looks a little scary. He doesn't have all his teeth, and his cheeks cave in on themselves as if his mouth were a pull string. And Bessie, well, people are scared of German shepherds, and she's a surprising sight because one eye is milky and reflects the light. That first afternoon, we saw him on the main road, headed into town as we headed out. We were on the gravel verge, and he made a showy loop to the other side of the road as he passed us and raised his hand in an old-fashioned country wave and nodded our way. A toothpick or an unlit cigarette stuck up out of his mouth, and his greasy cap was on backward, wings of hair poking out below. Bessie had her head half out the window on the passenger side, tongue lolling, eating the breeze. The sight made us laugh. "Dog joy," Cassie said. "Wish we could get us some." We wanted to walk out to the quarry simply to fill the time. We couldn't swim, or Cassie couldn't on account of her hand, but it seemed the place to explore, not least because we knew one of the trails through the woods from the quarry led to the old asylum. Cassie thought that was the coolest thing. If we could find our way to the asylum, who knew what we'd discover? She had some idea there'd be treasure, something hidden or left behind, something we couldn't imagine until it was revealed. "Maybe someone's even living there," she suggested, raising her eyebrows and smiling. "Somebody everybody thinks is gone." That seems like a reason not to go looking. Wimp. I'm not. Besides, if anybody was living there, we'd know about it. How? That close to town? You don't just get away with stuff like that. So we could pretend to live there, like for the afternoon. We didn't play pretend games anymore because we were too grown up, but secretly we missed them. A stage as big as an asylum seemed perfect. We could disappear into the woods to a secret hidey hole, and suddenly it would be okay to behave as though we were 10 again. And she was a World War II resistance fighter, and I'd parachuted in from England on a secret mission. Or we were the only two survivors after the apocalypse and had to live off nuts and berries and rainwater. The woods around Royston are great for those kinds of games. There are clearings in the trees and huge slabs of rock like tables, fallen logs to serve as benches, rocky overhangs underneath which you can build a little camp that will stay dry in all but the heaviest rainfall. They're not impenetrable, not a Hansel and Gretel forest, but a forest where the sunlight falls green and dappled to the soft, piney ground, where surprising toadstools sprout in clumps, flat red plates or piled cream ruffles, tiny yellow shiny bulbs, almost slick, and invisible birds call to one another in the high branches overhead. Sometimes you catch the bright flash of a red-winged blackbird or a cardinal, and upon occasion at the quarry itself, a misguided, preening egret teetering on its precarious pins, stretching its great wings and arching its prehistoric neck to glare at you from a bald, glittering eye. On that first day we tramped out to the quarry, we saw such an egret. We called her Nancy because the name made us laugh, and whenever we saw another after that, wherever it was, we waved and shouted, "Hey, Nancy, good to see ya." We felt like she was a good omen, a sign for us. Cassie took off her sneakers and socks and dangled her feet in the water while I fussed about whether she'd get her dressed hand wet in a puddle at the water's edge until she told me to shut up. It had been a hot walk, even under the trees, and I was tempted to strip off and plunge in even for a minute to make the swelling in my fingers and ankles go down. Some people swell in the heat, some people don't. Needless to say, Cassie didn't. But I'd made myself the promise that I wouldn't, so I too sat on the hot stone and dabbled my puffy feet, listening to the cicadas scream and wishing for more. It had taken almost an hour to get there from my house, and it would take as long to get back, and we hadn't brought so much as a bottle of water. As Nancy spread her wings and tucked her legs, lifting off like an airplane with barely a splash, Cassie threw back her head and narrowed her eyes. "It's good here," she said. Even better when we can swim. It's so deep, isn't it? The water, in its gray-greenness, was intensely clear, and yet you couldn't see the bottom. What do you think is down there? Stone, of course. It's a quarry. Ghosts, though? Do you think there are ghosts? We both knew the story of the teenager who drowned there long before we were born, back in the 1980s. A bunch of kids had come skinny dipping at night, drunk or high or both, and this boy had dived in head first and hit his head on a rock and never come up again. The kids were so rowdy they didn't even notice he wasn't with them until it was time to go home. And the police couldn't find his body until the next day. In Royston, we all knew that story from very young, although we knew it like a myth, not like a fact. We didn't know his name or anything. It was why there was a big sign at the parking lot that said, "No diving." Ghosts? Cassie squinted at me in the bright sun. Don't tell me you believe in ghosts. Don't tell me you don't. Of course I don't. What about your dad, then? Cassie shook her head and was quiet for a minute. That's not ghosts. That's angels. It's totally different. And it's not some stupid joke. She pulled her feet out of the water and turned her back to me, crossing her legs and hanging her head like a turtle tucking in on itself. I didn't mean, Cass, I'm sorry, okay? She didn't turn around straight away. When she did, she had a funny set to her mouth. I thought she was angry with me, and only afterward did it occur to me that she was trying not to cry. Time to head back, don't you think? She said. Didn't your mom promise grilled cheese? Cassie's father was as much a myth as the drowned boy. Not in the sense that he might not be real, but in the sense that she'd never actually known him, or rather that she couldn't remember him, except his face. She said she had a memory of him leaning over her crib, his blue eyes, and of feeling safe held in the crook of his arm, infant memories dark around the edges like an old photograph, but indelible. He had chosen her name, Cassandra, because he thought it was the most beautiful, and her bird bones came from his side, and her aptitude for math, or so Bev had told her, her love of onion rings, her stick-out ears. My father is so present in my life that I don't really even look at him, not properly. I love him fiercely, but in some way I barely see him. He makes bad puns, and my mother and I groan. He gets angry about my gear cluttering up the front hall, and I roll my eyes. I know his face so well that I can't tell when it's changing. My mother pointed out the other day that more than half his hair is gray now. When did that happen? How could I not have noticed? He said that's what family's for, that people who love you see you in the best light, as you want to be seen. He made out it wasn't just because I hadn't been looking. Whereas for Cassie, it was as if her father stood behind a thick black curtain with a few tiny holes in it. She had to get up close to those pinpricks and peer through, trying to glean her father's overall shape from the little she could glimpse. Bev had told her the story 1,000 times about how he died. They were living in a farmhouse about 40 minutes northwest of Boston when Cassie was born, and Bev, though she'd finished her coursework, hadn't yet qualified as a nurse. Cassie's father, whose name was Clark Burns, that's a good name, right? Cassie whispered whenever we talked about it, like he was a movie star, like Clark Gable or Harrison Ford, worked 2 jobs so they'd have enough money until Bev could start working too. He was a biology teacher at the junior high in Belmont, Massachusetts. We looked it up on Google Earth once just to see the building. And then 3 nights a week he worked as a bartender at a pub in Brighton, which, as Bev explained to Cassie and Cassie to me, is basically in Boston. Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Cassie even knew which days. Late on a Friday night when he was driving home from Boston in bad weather, a February night when Cassie was just 11 months old, another car came across the median and hit him head on. A drunk driver. Bev would tell how she'd fallen asleep and woken at 4 a.m. with Cassie cozy in the bed beside her and no Clark. He hadn't come home and he didn't answer his cell phone. She wasn't a worrier, so her first thought was that he'd stayed over in Boston at a friend's, which he sometimes did, and she felt annoyed because it was going to be Saturday and they'd had plans and now everything would be late. She went back to sleep feeling annoyed at Clark, and she woke up again around 7 still feeling annoyed, and then at 7:30 the police called and she found out that Clark was dead. All the years since, Bev had told my mother, and my mother had told me, she'd felt guilty about being annoyed, about not thinking the best of him, when of course he would have been home if he could have been. He'd been on his way. Clark Burns was like an angel for Cassie. She believed that he watched over her and kept her safe. She had dreams where they were together, always good dreams, where they toasted marshmallows or rode bikes, or where he tucked her into bed at night and she'd memorize his face, the face she remembered from when she was a baby in her crib. When she was 8, she'd heard his voice in her head. She'd known it was his voice somehow, telling her not to go out onto the ice on Long Pond in January. She was walking the Audubon Loop with her mother, but had run on ahead and wanted desperately to go sliding, and as she was about to jump off the bank, the voice said, "Stay with me, baby doll. Stay here on the shore." That's what Cassie said. He'd called her baby doll, and just hearing the words made her feel safe. He was with her, she was never alone, which was totally different from some cartoon phantom haunting the quarry. Sometimes, she told me, I'm totally sure he's alive, not just in my mind, but really out there, like he's just around the corner waiting for me, for real, because I can feel him so close by, you know, like he's with me. Angels, she'd whispered fiercely, are real. I'd seen his picture. Cassie kept it in a plastic baggie in her underwear drawer and sometimes slept with it under her pillow. It was strange to me that there weren't pictures of him all over their house, pictures of him and Bev together or him holding Cassie as a baby, but Cassie explained that her mother's grief had been so intense and so deep that for a long time she couldn't bear to look at photos of Clark and had hidden them all. They didn't even have a grave to visit because he'd been cremated, and Bev told Cassie about their winter trip to the seashore, Cassie not even walking yet, to scatter his ashes in the Atlantic. Flecks had blown back in their faces, Bev told Cassie, and probably they'd swallowed a few. It wasn't disgusting, she said. It was a miracle of nature that he was always inside them. Miraculously, that one photo had survived, tucked into the back of the family Bible where Cassie had found it when she was about 7. She was using the Bible to build a racing run for Matchbox cars, and it had fallen out. They'd never spoken about it, although her mother had surely seen it in her underwear drawer. Cassie wasn't trying to hide it. In truth, it was hard to tell exactly what Clark Burns looked like. The photo was from a long time ago and blurry, taken in front of what looked like a barn on a gray fall day. The man in the picture had a square face and floppy blondish hair over one eye, and his hands were stuffed in his jeans pockets. He'd been moving a bit when the shutter snapped, so you couldn't even tell that his eyes were blue. Bev had told Cassie they were, and you couldn't really describe his expression, like he was on the verge of something, in between moments rather than in one. He wore a blue T-shirt with a peace sign on it, and over top a red and black plaid flannel shirt. The shirt always seemed to me the most definite thing in the photograph, the only thing you could be absolutely certain you'd recognize, which was strange because it looked like a million other plaid flannel shirts. In the fall, in tiny Royston, you might see half a dozen of those shirts on any given day. I never said that to Cassie. Why would I? It wasn't what she needed to hear. So instead, when we looked at the photo together, we'd try to pick out which of his features she'd inherited, which blurry bits she carried around in her body. Knowing all this and how she felt about him, I should never have brought it up the way I did, as if I didn't understand what he meant to her. She didn't mention it again, but it was one of those events that was little and big at the same time. We made our way home for grilled cheese and chocolate shakes. Then we filled a plastic basin and gave each other pedicures until Bev came to pick Cassie up. I painted Union Jacks on her toes. I'd watched a YouTube video on how to do it, and they came out well except on her baby toes where the nails were too tiny. She couldn't do anything nearly so fancy for me because of her hand, so she just painted my toes dark blue, and I stuck on little silver star stickers. My feet looked like the night sky. Thank you.
Bring the lights up. There we go. Anybody have a question? We'll take a few questions before the signing. Yes, sir. Speak up, please.
In last week's issue of the New York Review of Books, Karen Phillips writes that, of course, John Banville would regard the narratives of Benjamin Black as vulgar narrative. And I was wondering if you might comment on that quotation.
He said what? That I would regard... I'm sorry.
What did you refer to Benjamin Black as?
Yeah.
Say it again.
As vulgar narrative, she said. Banville would no doubt regard Benjamin Black's fiction as vulgar.
Oh, vulgar narratives. Yes, yes. Well, I do, of course. He's my bit of rough. He's my.
Is he a Henry James fan?
Hmm?
Is Black a Henry James fan?
Oh, good God, no. I wouldn't think Benjamin Black had ever heard of Henry James. Vulgar is a nice word. I quite like it. It comes from... Well, it's an honorable word. It's to do with, the people. it's aimed at, Benjamin Black aims his books at a vulgar audience. But a vulgar audience is, I like vulgarity.
Yes.
The question is whether the I suppose there's a word, it wouldn't be marginality, they're not marginal, but the ignorability, is that a word, of narratives factors into my, you remind me, I remember years ago, Christopher Hitchens saying to me, would it kill you to write something people actually wanted to read? Which would lead you to think that perhaps I did make that choice. But no, I actually write things that interest me. One of the things, I grew up in a household where both my parents were tremendous readers. My father chiefly of nonfiction and my mother of fiction, and she was a reader particularly of women writers and 20th century women writers, a lot of modernist writers. And so I grew up, I think, with a sort of strange sense with a strange canon, as it were, of things that I thought everybody read, and then it turned out they didn't. And I only realized that when I grew up. But I read Catherine Mansfield and Antonia White and Molly Keane. I mean, all those Virago books that came out in the 70s, and Elizabeth Bowen and Virginia Woolf, and when I was about 13, my favorite writer was Jean Rhys. So I had a kind of I think a funny idea of what was normal, and then in that culture way you kind of forget that. You go on, you read like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and whatever, and you kind of forget, but it's in there and it sort of shaped you already.
Yes.
Mr. Banville, this summer I read the book of Evidence and Shroud, and I am just in awe of your prose. I had to have a dictionary by my side to look up a lot of vocabulary, and I'm wondering, does this vocabulary come from your reading, or do you think of a word and say, no, I'm going to look for a synonym, or it's just incredible. So is it from your reading itself, that vocabulary, or is it something you actively search for as you're writing?
Well, when we begin to speak, we very basic vocabulary, and of course it's from my reading and it's from looking up dictionaries. People constantly complain to me about having to go to the dictionary. What's wrong with having to go to the dictionary? One of the greatest inventions of humankind is the dictionary. Marvelous book. And when you look something up, you always look up 2 or 3 other words, and you think, God, I didn't know that was what that meant. To give a more precise answer, the sentence dictates the word. The sentence requires the word, and sometimes one has to search for it. I wouldn't be so vulgar as to consult Roget's Thesaurus to look for a word. I would only look for a word that I couldn't remember. The sentence, as I say, dictates the word. It asks for the precise word. It's all about preciseness. And it seems to me that there's no point in trying to write about the world and trying to capture a version of the world unless one aims for precision.
May I just add something to that, which is that I think it was an introduction. It was something by Paul Auster that I read years ago, that Racine used 8,000 words and his contemporary Shakespeare 24,000. The gift of the English language is of tremendous breadth and elasticity, which enables greater precision.
Yeah, and I would add to that, tyrants love simple language. And they love inaccurate language, as you of all nations in the world know at the moment. It's our duty, our small duty, our small little job in the world, to keep the language rich, to keep it pure, and to keep it precise.
Yes.
As precision is so important to you, how do you feel about working with translators who translate your work into other languages, and languages that you maybe don't read or speak?
Well, this is a question for both of us. Why don't you go first?
You know, it's an interesting, it's better not to know, eh? It's just, I mean, I had the experience, I for the past few books, I've had the same translator in French, which is the one that I can and do read, and she's absolutely marvelous. And her predecessor was very good, but there was the moment where in the English, people sat down to play a rubber of bridge, and in the French, a rubber tube appeared. It's just so, like, I feel like in Serbo-Croatian, it's better I don't know.
Claire is absolutely right. It's better not to know. And I've always loved, there was an English working class novel in the 1950s, it was very popular at the time, called Room at the Top. And room at the top means, you know, there's always room at the top for an ambitious young boy. It was translated into Swedish as the attic.
Maybe one or two more. Yes.
I just wondered if in preparation for tonight, knowing you would be together, that you read each other's books, and if so, that either of you see any parallels between the continuation of Isabel's story and the two girls in your story.
Well, now's the time to announce that we've been having an affair for a long time. Isn't that right, Claire?
For many years, actually. And in fact, partially wrote one another's books. Surprising as that may seem.
Sorry, I gave a facetious answer. I've always felt that I was part of a guild. The guild goes back a long time. We're jealous of each other. We hate each other. I remember the first time I met Martin Amis. He and I had lunch, and two short men, you know, just trying to stand higher than each other. And we sat down in a nice little restaurant in London, and after 5 minutes of polite conversation, I said, look, Martin, let's agree that you hate me and I hate you, right? If you win a prize, I really resent you. You get a great review, and the same as, and he thought about it for a minute. He said, yeah, that's true. And we've been friends ever since.
I think probably that's enough. Thank the writers. And join us for a book signing in the lounge behind the hall.